Good evening, BookTube. I said good evening. I should say good afternoon. It's still afternoon here in the United Kingdom. I've decided to make a video to discuss my recent read, The Fall of Heaven, the Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran. This was an incredibly gripping read. It is a labor of love with a ton of research that has gone into this. The author, who is an adjunct professor of history at Columbia University, did what must be dozens of interviews with various people, mostly people who were part of the inner circle of the royal family in Iran during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, or at the very least were key decision makers in terms of the response that was decided to many of the insurrections, insurgencies, and, quite frankly, terrorist atrocities that took place during these tumultuous final days of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. Now, I am one of those people who considers the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to be a catastrophe that should never have happened, and so I obviously have my own biases in that regard, and these are actually shared by the author, Hooper, who is clearly leaning towards the Pahlavi side of events. And that is something which is reflected in the people he interviews, who are overwhelmingly people who were part of the Iranian regime, especially Queen Farah herself, but also people like Parviz Sabeti, who was the deputy director of SAVAK, which was the Shah's intelligence service, and had an undeserved, in my opinion, reputation for brutality and cruelty, which, of course, was, quite frankly, minuscule in comparison with the horrors of Khomeini and his thugs after they took power and created their own successor organization to SAVAK. So he interviews people like Parviz Sabeti, people like Ardeshir Zahedi, who was the Shah's foreign minister for many years and also one of the key players at court, and who was also for some years the Shah's son-in-law. He was actually still alive at the time that this book was written. He has since died. Uh, so Ardeshir Zahedi is one of the people interviewed. Eli Antoniades, one of Queen Farah's closest friends from childhood, is among those who are interviewed in here. Uh, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, the first president of the Islamic Republic, who later fell out with Khomeini and was forced into exile, is also among those who are interviewed. One of the people who are interviewed in here is also a young man whose name I've forgotten. I think Hossein or something like that. But he was a young member of the revolutionary underground during the events that this book narrates, and his story is also quite fascinating. As much as I despise everything that he and his colleagues stand for, and everything they did, his account and his own perspective on these events are invaluable, I think. And it seems as if Scott Cooper has spoken to pretty much everyone who had anything to do with the events of 1979. It is a spectacular work. It is a masterful retelling of one of the seminal events in world history, and it begins with an account of the Shah's reign, an account of all of the things that he had done in his 37 years to modernize his country and to bring it kicking and screaming into modernity. It talks about the opposition he faced, some of the challenges, some of the uprisings that he faced in his time, especially in 1953 when his Prime Minister, Mossadegh, and he fell out over the whole business of oil nationalization. His subsequent triumphant return and the deposition of Mossadegh in what many people claim it was a CIA coup. I think it's a lot more complex than that. And the White Revolution that he launched in the 1960s, the primary aim of that being to take land away from the powerful landowning class and also the clergy who owned large swathes of Iranian land at that time, and to give that to the peasantry. The aim being to create a stable middle class of independent, prosperous peasant farmers who would be a loyal constituency of the Shah's regime. And alongside this, there was also the decision to give women the right to vote, which didn't count for that much because Iran wasn't exactly a democracy under the Shah, but it meant something, at least symbolically. And there were also measures to combat illiteracy in the countryside. In particular, there was a whole section of the Iranian army that was sent into the countryside to teach the peasantry how to read and write, and by that means bring Iran into the modern era and to create what should have been a modern, forward-thinking, educated workforce that could bring Iran into the modern age and could bring about her social and economic prosperity. Now, this backfired in a big way when some sections of the clergy, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini, challenged the Shah's rule and condemned his reforms as being un-Islamic and as being a slap in the face to centuries of tradition. The Shah responded in caustic and authoritarian fashion to these people who he branded as enemies of progress, and when Khomeini decided to foment an uprising in the summer of 1963, it was dealt with brutally and crushingly. Now, at that time, the Shah did not actually have the courage to crack down himself, so he delegated this rather unpleasant business to his Prime Minister at that time, Asadullah Alam, who comes across in this book as being one of the few people in the Shah's inner circle that actually knew what he was doing. And it's a tragedy that Alam wasn't around in 1978 to 9 when the revolution got going, because his cool head and his practical intelligence would have really come in handy, in contrast to the floundering of all of those people around him, especially people like Hoveyda and Nasiri, who were quite frankly useless in a crisis. Now, the Shah had a big problem, which is that despite the image he projected of being this all-knowing authoritarian, he was in fact a very timid man who shied from the use of violence and the use of oppression. And one thing which Scott Cooper makes quite clear in this magnificent book is that the Shah was deeply attached to this concept that's known in Farsi as the Fard. Now, the Fard is this idea that there is a mystical bond between the Shah, the king, and the people, and that this bond, this divinely ordained bond, can be destroyed if a Shah is repressive or tyrannical. And so even as he ruled in an authoritarian fashion, the Shah always shied away from being anywhere near as brutal as some of his contemporary dictators, for example, Suharto in Indonesia. And whenever he was faced with a crisis, for example, the riots of 1963 or the revolution of 1979, he was essentially paralyzed. He couldn't bring himself to use the violence that was required to crack down on his enemies. And indeed, in 1953, during the events that led to Mossadegh's ouster, the Shah was nowhere to be found. In fact, the actual hard work of overthrowing Mossadegh was done by one of his generals, Fazlollah Zahedi, who spearheaded the insurrection that brought about Mossadegh's downfall. And the Shah, who was actually in exile at this time, did not come back until he was reassured that his people actually wanted him. So far from being this brutal, murderous dictator, the Shah was an incredibly mild and even benevolent ruler. And I say this as someone who does have a bias towards the Pahlavi dynasty, and like Scott Cooper, believes that the revolution was a disaster. In some ways, a disaster waiting to happen. In some ways, a disaster brought about by the Shah's own policies and his own mistakes, which are dealt with in great and loving detail in this book. It feels like just about every aspect of Iranian social and political and economic life is really put under the radar in this book. In particular, he sheds a lot of light on the way in which the Shah's reforms in the countryside actually led to a situation where thousands upon thousands of young Iranians were leaving the countryside because they were no longer needed as farm laborers, and they were pouring into the cities, where they were quickly exposed to all sorts of radical ideas, revolutionary ideas, promoted by Marxists, but also by Muslim clergy. And the result was that by the 1970s, a lot of these people were part of underground terrorist organizations like the Mujahedin-e-Khalq and the Fedayin-e-Islam, which were dedicated to overthrowing Khomeini's, the Shah's government. Now, during this time, the Shah's arch-enemy, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been forced into exile as a result of his fulminations against the Shah during the 1963 riots that nearly brought about the downfall of the monarchy, had been essentially continuing his battle from exile. He would deliver these sermons in which he would castigate the monarchy in the most fiery and acrimonious terms, and these would be recorded via tape cassettes, and these tape cassettes would be smuggled back into Iran for his followers to listen to. And these cassettes were widely available. The government was all but powerless to really stop their flowing into Iran. They were being sold openly on the streets of Tehran and other cities by the merchants, or the bazaris as they were known, who were traditionally a very powerful and very influential class of people in Iranian society, that the Shah's policies of modernization actually did much to alienate. In particular, his obsession with creating a new Western style economy in the form of massive department stores of the kind that you might find in America, which were a threat to the livelihood of the bazaars and their much more traditional, if somewhat primitive, way of selling their goods. And it wasn't helped by the fact that they were increasingly weighed down by taxation and by all manner of government regulation, which, ironically, for a revolution which in many ways was incredibly authoritarian in its own right, is actually a rather libertarian sentiment to have. And I'm sure that many American right-wingers would actually sympathize with this anti-government attitude on the part of Iran's traditional business class. So there was the alienation of not just the clergy, but also the traditional merchants who were responsible for so much of what went on in urban Iran during this time. They weren't just merchants, they didn't just sell things, they were also responsible for cooperating with the clergy in organizing all manner of religious processions and things of that kind. And there was very much a symbiotic relationship between the two. So that when the Shah alienated both of these important constituencies, both of them started inexorably becoming allies in the face of this assault by the imperial state. Now, Cooper is very solid when it comes to discussing the sociology behind the revolution and behind the development of the revolutionary movement to overthrow the monarchy. And it's quite clear from everything that he writes about here in this book that the revolution was a disaster waiting to happen. One thing which I wasn't that aware of previously, but I'm much more aware of now, thanks to this book, is just how violent the revolution was. This wasn't some peaceful popular uprising. This was a violent terrorist insurgency, which was of course coupled with demonstrations, many of them peaceful, but many of them violent, on the streets of the capital. And in the run-up to the revolution and the overthrow of the government, there was what can only be described as an organized terrorist campaign to return Iran back to the Dark Ages. Increasingly, women were being intimidated into taking the veil. University campuses that had been built by the Shah were stormed by Khomeini and Khomeiniist supporters and destroyed. Banks and other signs of government authority were set upon and burned. The security forces would sit back and would simply not intervene because the Shah had told them that he did not want any bloodshed. The army would simply stand by and watch as these outrages went on. And all through this time, the Shah was continuing to delude himself that all was well, up until the last minute, when it was clear that his people had overwhelmingly chosen to reject him. And the response on the Shah's part was one of dismay, anger, and deep bitterness that the country that he had done so much for would turn against him in this fashion. Now, the Shah did not do what many other rulers in his position would have done. From 1976 onwards, he had been launching an ambitious program of liberalization that was designed to turn Iran back into a constitutional monarchy. To this end, he legalized political activity, he lifted censorship, he encouraged debate and discussion about the future of the country. Now, what this led to is invariably his revolutionary enemies took advantage of this vacuum which had opened up to incite agitation against his regime. And despite the pleas of so many of his senior ministers and also people in the armed forces and people in Savak, the Shah simply refused to put the brakes on his ambitious program of liberalization. Quite the contrary, if anything, he actually accelerated this program with devastating results. And it's quite clear to me that what the Shah did was a dangerous and, frankly, inexcusable dereliction of duty here. What he should have done, in my view, is clamp down hard on the radicals who were fomenting this violence and this lawlessness. And it simply beggars belief that every time the Shah was called upon by his senior ministers or by members of the armed forces to give them the powers they needed to clamp down hard, he simply could not bring himself to do so. And it is this refusal to act which accelerated the pace of the revolution and brought about the downfall of the Pahlavi dynasty and put an end to 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy. Many people will say that that is laudable on his part, that he chose to leave peacefully rather than stain his reign with blood. But I can't help but think that he was guilty of, quite frankly, dereliction of duty in abandoning his people, abandoning all those who remained loyal to him during the crisis, and leaving them to be slaughtered by Khomeini and his thugs. And the history of the Middle East and indeed the world would be so much different if the Shah had had more steel during this crisis, if he had been more like Alam during the 1963 crisis, if he had appointed people like Ovesi and Sabeti to leading roles and given them the powers they needed to clamp down instead of each time refusing to give his sanction for this to take place, the history of that country would be so much more different. Iran would not now be a haven of terrorism. Its name would no longer be synonymous with violence and extremism. The Ayatollah Khomeini would be all but forgotten. Indeed, the Shah had multiple opportunities to actually have Khomeini killed, and he simply did not take them. Saddam Hussein offered, when Khomeini was staying in Najaf in Iraq, to have Khomeini assassinated. He did not do so. The Shah would not give permission for this to happen. Moderate clerics like the Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari, who was strongly opposed to Khomeini's rather heretical interpretation of Shia Islam, begged the Shah to reconsider, and he simply would not do so. It beggars belief, and I can't help but think that his failure, his monumental failure to tackle the forces of backwardness head-on, was a tragedy for not just himself, but also for his people. Now, the Shah would die a broken man in exile in Egypt in 1980. His son, Reza Pahlavi, the Crown Prince, remains an activist against the regime in Tehran, as does his mother, the rather aged Queen Farah, who lives in exile in Paris, France, along with many others who fled the country during those very tragic days of 1978 to 79. This is a spectacular work which will probably never be bettered in terms of how definitive it is. I'm sure that there are individual aspects which perhaps could be talked about in more detail, but in terms of an overall picture of what was happening, especially in terms of the intrigues that were going on at the highest level of Iranian politics, both in the royal family but also within the revolutionary camp, I think it's a work that probably will not be improved upon in my lifetime. But this is The Fall of Heaven, the Pahlavis and the Final Days of Imperial Iran. I greatly enjoyed reading this, and I learned an awful lot from reading it. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and I'm going to say goodbye, BookTube.